Michael Schumacher actually got his start in Formula One thanks to another driver getting arrested, and that's only one part of the history of the team that we know as Aston Martin. Depending on how familiar you are with Formula One, you may know Aston Martin specifically from their Succession-style intro on Drive to Survive. However, there is so much more to this team, and today we're gonna get into it. Welcome back to Grid Chat, your one-stop shop for everything Formula One. I'm your host, Marissa Tandon, and right now, while there are no cars on track, we are using the off-season to do an educational series. The idea is that whether you started watching Formula One last year or you're starting brand new this season, or you've been watching Formula One for a long time and have never really felt like there's a place for you to ask questions, if you listen to this series during the off-season, by the time we have lights out in Australia, you will know everything you need to know to watch Formula One. Obviously, there will always be more deeper technical aspects that you could go into with this sport, but right now we're just focused on the basics. So far, we've already covered how a race weekend works and the things that you can expect to see, the different members that make up a team and the different jobs you could have. Spoiler alert, it's a lot more than just the two drivers that you see on track. We've also covered the point system, why there are two different championships and how things work there. And now we're in the section where we're talking a little bit more about the history of the grid. Ideally, if you don't already have a team that you're supporting, this will help you pick one, as well as help you get to know a little bit more about the teams themselves, the drivers on track, and some history behind each of the teams. Whether you've already picked a team or you're looking to pick one, this portion of this educational series will help you understand which team might be the fit for you. Plus, if you want to get a little art of war with it, it's important to know your enemy so that you can crush them. So far, we have already covered McLaren, Red Bull, Ferrari, and Mercedes, plus the other basics episodes that I already mentioned. If you're just tuning in for the first time now, you can always scroll back and listen to those episodes as well. But if you've been here the whole time, today we are talking about Aston Martin. Now, this team actually has a pretty rich history, and it hasn't always been known as Aston Martin. So let's start with a little bit of a deep dive into the history of this team. When we talk about the history of Aston Martin, there are actually kind of two different paths. First, we have the original Formula One entry of Aston Martin as a team. That was in 1959. However, by the end of the following year in 1960, they ended their entire foray into Formula One, having never scored a single point. They pretty much looked at it and they were like, look, this is, it's not working for us. We're not scoring points. It's not worth the investment we're getting out of Formula One. And they stayed out of Formula One for a long period of time. From the end of that 1960 season when they dropped out until 2016 when they became a Red Bull sponsor, Aston Martin was not a part of the Formula One grid. Aston Martin as a company did return as a sponsor of Red Bull from 2016 to 2020. However, this was just as a sponsor as a company. They were not a Formula One team as we know them today. Aston Martin as we know them today officially returned to the grid in 2021. So that's one leg of the history, the official Aston Martin brand and how they belong in Formula One. But the team that we know as Aston Martin today has not always been called Aston Martin, and their history goes back much further than 2021. The team that we now know as Aston Martin actually started in 1991 under a different name. That original team was called Jordan Grand Prix, and they competed from 1991 to 2005 under that name. That team was founded by Eddie Jordan, an Irish businessman who originally was a driver himself. Eddie Jordan was the Irish kart champion in 1971, and by 1974 he was racing in Formula Ford, followed by a campaign in Formula 3. Jordan also competed in the 24-hour of Le Mans, but ultimately never made it to Formula 1, and due to funding eventually retired. He moved into team management and eventually in 1991 formed his Formula One team, Jordan Grand Prix. Now, one of the most interesting things to come out of the beginning of this Jordan Grand Prix team is the fact that Michael Schumacher actually got his start there. However, the way that seat actually became available is a story of crime, actually. See, originally, Jordan Grand Prix's driver lineup included a driver named Bertrand Gachot, and things with Gachot and the Jordan Grand Prix team were actually going pretty well. The car was performing at a higher level than they expected it to be, and Bertrand was actually performing pretty well as a driver. However, Bertrand got into a little bit of an altercation with a taxi driver. We've actually heard him speak about the incident more in hindsight recently, but essentially on the way to a sponsor meeting, Bertrand was stuck in traffic, and the taxi driver in front of him was driving in a way that to Bertrand was very upsetting. So at a certain point, he just sort of lightly tapped the guy's bumper, and the taxi driver did not take very kindly to that. What followed was a physical altercation that ended in Bertrand using tear gas on the taxi driver. The police were called by Bertrand himself, and when they arrived, they did in fact arrest and jail him. When he showed up for his day in court, Bertrand said that he was actually expecting sort of a slap on the wrist. However, he was sentenced to 2 years in prison, which ultimately led to Jordan Grand Prix dropping him as a driver and replacing him with Michael Schumacher. So in a kind of odd way, if you are a fan of Michael Schumacher Schumacher and what he has done for this sport, you kind of have tear gas and a hot-headed driver to thank for that, as well as the team that eventually would become Aston Martin. Some other notable drivers from this era of this team include Ralf Schumacher, Michael Schumacher's brother, Rubens Barrichello, Takuma Sato, who actually went on to win the Indy 500 twice, and Martin Brundle, who you definitely know from the current Formula One era for his grid walk. Jordan Grand Prix competed as a team under that name and ownership until 2005. That was when we saw the first sale of this team to Midland Group. That team was renamed as Spiker in 2007, and the team heavily struggled until 2008 when we saw the second sale of this team. In 2008, that team was purchased by Vijay Mallya, and the team was renamed Force India. Now, Force India operated under that name from 2008 to 2018, and during that first period of time, they really become what we sort of look at as the best bargain for your buck. In Formula One, we have this odd sort of spread, where we have a couple of teams that are always competing at the top, a couple of teams that are always in the back, and then you have sort of one of the more interesting parts of the sport, which is the middle section. The teams that are at the top that have always been at the top are your teams like Ferrari, Mercedes, Red Bull, where they're very, very well funded, very well focused, and have the kind of background that they are able to continue being successful. Then you have teams that do fall to the back of the grid. Teams right now that you would look at as sort of stake Formula One team, or teams like Williams, which we will get to later in this series, was actually a top team for a period of time and then fell to where they are today. And hopefully they're on an upswing as well. But then in the middle, we have these teams that we sort of look at as the best of the rest. Your main teams are always going to sort of be at the top, and something that can be really interesting, especially in periods of dominance like we just had with Red Bull and with Max Verstappen, or teams like before that with Mercedes and Lewis Hamilton, it can be really interesting to focus on that midsection. And Force India was really a successful team in that middle section. By 2017, they had actually gotten up to 4th in the Constructors' Championship. And one of the drivers that they had that was actually pretty successful with them was Checo Perez, a driver that you may know from last season as Max Verstappen's teammate and who currently no longer has a Formula One seat. However, Checo was actually quite successful for Force India. Of the team's 5 podium finishes, all of them were achieved by Checo. 2 other drivers that also drove for Force India that you know of today from our current Formula One grid are Nico Hülkenberg and Esteban Ocon. So how did Force India turn into Aston Martin? There were a couple of steps, but the first and foremost is that the owner of the team, Vijay, was accused of fraud in India, not paying back debts, defaulting on loans, and ultimately the team became a victim of that. In 2018, Force India was put into administration by a UK court. Administration is a process that happens in the UK when a business is unable to pay its debts. And while that was quite stressful for the team as a whole, in a very different way, remember what we talked about with Mercedes and Honda, and how Brawn GP formed out of trying to keep those jobs on the grid. Something similar happens here with Force India. The team is placed into administration due to Vijay's debts, and then an investor group called Racing Point UK, which was led by Lawrence Stroll, who is Lance Stroll's dad, and also a billionaire, purchased Force India. That team then became Racing Point Force India, and later just Racing Point. Lance Stroll at the time was driving for Williams, but in 2019 he moved over to race with his dad's team. Lawrence Stroll was in control of the team back in 2019, but in 2021 the team goes from being known as Racing Point to being turned into Aston Martin's return to the grid. The 2021 pairing includes a legend of Formula One, Sebastian Vettel, and his teammate at the time was Lance Stroll. Sebastian Vettel's last era of his very incredible career ends at Aston Martin, because at the end of 2022, Sebastian Vettel drops one of the most dramatic Instagram videos I've ever seen, fully black and white, and announces his retirement from the sport, which leads us to the current driver lineup. Now, there are 3 main figures I want to talk about when it comes to Aston Martin today. We'll start with the drivers. Now, if you've listened to this podcast over the past season, you'll know that Lance Stroll, I honestly think, gets way too much hate. Lance Stroll is in fact the son of the billionaire owner of Aston Martin, Lawrence Stroll. But objectively, one of the things you need to understand about Formula One if you're going to get into this sport is that not only is nepotism a thing, every single driver that is on this grid brings something other than just their talent. And generally speaking, it's always going to be connected to money in some capacity. Formula One is one of the most expensive sports to participate in, and there are only 20 seats for the entire world currently available. 22 will be available in 2026, starting with Cadillac's entry to the grid. This means that the unfortunate truth about Formula One is that you cannot just be talented and get into the sport. It is not a meritocracy, it's not a merit-based business as much as we want to think sports are. There are so many different things that lead to someone getting a seat on the Formula One grid. It's just that some of those things are more obvious than others, and Lance Stroll's connection to his dad owning the team is obviously going to be a little bit more visible than others. So let's talk about Lance's path to Formula One. He started karting when he was 10 years old, and he is from Canada, and in 2010 he was welcomed into the Ferrari Driver Academy. He won his first title in Italian F4 with Prema, and then he also raced in the Toyota Racing Series and had a very dominant season in Formula 3. In 2017, Lance signed with Williams, and he made his Formula One debut at 18 years old. Lance raced for Williams for 2017 and 2018 before moving over to Racing Point in 2019, and in his full career, he's had 3 podiums and 1 pole position. He has yet to win a Formula One race, and his career best in the World Drivers' Championship is 10th. I think the thing to remember about Lance is that he does get a lot of flack, but ultimately he did have these moments in the beginning of his career that were very promising. There is potential there if he's pushed in the right direction with the right teammate and hopefully with the right car. But if you decide that Lance Stroll is your driver, you are going to see a lot of conversation about Nepo Baby and sort of his attitude, because sometimes his temper can flare past where it should be. This is something that is pretty much true for every Formula One driver, but does seem to kind of come out of Lance in ways that are very on camera and very public. And sometimes his attitude can be on the sort of negative side. I don't think he necessarily gives the most positive post-race press conferences or things like that. I have a weird soft spot for Lance that I think just comes from the fact that I think his relationship with his dad is actually quite sweet. This has nothing to do with racing or prowess or anything like that, but Lance has talked about the fact that his dad used to come to every single one of his karting races and his races after that, and they have a very strong and genuine relationship. There are so many comparisons to Succession, the television show, but quite frankly, I actually think that they just have this nice relationship that they show, at least, where his dad loves him so much that he bought him a Formula One team. And I think there's something kind of nice about that. It points to this like ultimate parenting goal. If you had $1 billion, would you spend it to buy your son a Formula One team? Maybe. I kind of like the idea that he would. Lance Stroll's teammate is Fernando Alonso. At 43 years old, Fernando Alonso is the oldest driver on the grid. Right behind him is Lewis Hamilton at 40. And he has been in Formula One for a very, very long time. His very first entry into a Formula One race was in 2001. Fernando has raced for a number of teams in Formula One. Those teams include Renault, McLaren, Ferrari, Alpine, and now Aston Martin. He's had 32 race wins and he was world champion twice. They were back-to-back titles in both 2005 and 2006. Fernando is also an interesting driver because he's had a career outside of Formula One and returned to Formula One. Fernando has raced in both endurance racing and the Indy 500 as he was chasing something we call the Motorsports Triple Crown. To win the Triple Crown, a driver needs to win the Indy 500, the 24 Hours of Le Mans, and the Monaco Grand Prix. Fernando has entered the Indy 500 a number of times with Arrow McLaren, but unfortunately has not been able to add that to his roster. Due to his long career, Fernando has also broken some records. In 2022, he broke the record for the most race starts in Formula One. In 2023, he took his 100th podium, becoming one of only 6 drivers to have accomplished that in Formula One. And in 2024, he became the first Formula One driver to start 400 Grand Prix. When we talk about Fernando Alonso, I think we talk about longevity of career and someone who's been able to go through so many different eras of Formula One. He's also tried his hand at other different types of racing and has continued to return to Formula One as his home. Currently, we are approaching the end of his career, and we've seen him say that 2026 is most likely going to be his final season. So what does that mean for the current state of Aston Martin? One of the things that I think is very interesting about where Aston Martin stands now is that they are shifting into a new phase of the team. Part of that has a lot to do with the changes in their engine supplier and one very big hire that they recently made. While Lance Stroll sort of has a blank checkbook to stay on the team, Fernando Alonso himself has already talked about retiring and most likely would stay on the team in sort of an advisory role at that point. And as I mentioned earlier, Aston Martin has been in that sort of mid-range portion of the field, meaning that we haven't really seen them compete for championships. However, over the past couple of years, we have seen a large investment into this team from Lawrence Stroll. And with that investment comes a lot of talent and a lot of intention to get to that top part of the grid. Whether or not it will pay off will be something to be seen. However, I think there are 2 big moves that might make a big difference. One of those moves is bringing on Honda. Right now, Honda is actually the engine supplier for Red Bull, but we know that they will be ending that partnership at the end of this season in 2025 and moving on to partner with Ford. When that happens, Honda will be moving over to Aston Martin. And we know that Honda has been a big portion of this dominance for Red Bull's car. The interesting part will be to see what Ford brings to the table when they kind of fully take over, and also whether or not Honda's dominance can shift into Aston Martin. But if there is someone who can help them do that, it would be Adrian Newey. Aston Martin actually hired Adrian Newey away from Red Bull last year, with one of the biggest deals that we've ever heard of for a technical partner. Adrian Newey's deal at Aston Martin is reportedly worth up to £30 million per year, once you account for all of the possible bonuses. And it's very clear that they're hoping that this will make a big difference in the car itself. Adrian Newey is a name that comes up when we talk about many different teams. And every time we talk about him, it's because he ushered in a very intensely dominant period for those teams. He's probably one of the only technical directors that Formula One fans in general know by name, and he is a bit of a wizard with the car. And so what's interesting about this partnership between Adrian Newey and Aston Martin is that it starts at the same time as this Honda partnership is starting as well. And Honda is the partner that Adrian Newey has built this Red Bull dominance period with. So there's already sort of a working relationship there. There's already an understanding as to what Honda can do and how Adrian Newey needs them to work. The possibility here is that we actually see Aston Martin in 2026, when the new regulations come through, really surprise everyone. This is the type of sort of magic in a bottle that we saw when it happened with Mercedes, when they first started the hybrid era of Formula One. Sometimes sometimes one team really finds an advantage at the very beginning of these technical changes, and then that advantage really takes them through a number of seasons. It could be cool for Aston Martin to be that next team, and Adrian Newey is taking on this new challenge of being at the peak of his career and starting fresh with a new team that really is starting over. The question will also be what their driver lineup looks like at the time, whether Fernando Alonso and Lance Stroll will stay long term, or if Fernando retiring opens up a space for someone else. One of those possible drivers would be Yuki Tsunoda, who currently drives for VCARB. However, Yuki has a long-term relationship with Honda, and both Yuki and Honda have made it clear that it would be great if they could find a place for him at Aston Martin. Right now, there isn't a place for him, but it is possible that we could see that change as things move forward. So if you decide to be a fan of Aston Martin, there is a long amount of history even though the team is actually pretty new to the grid. There are two drivers who have very different personalities and very different things that they bring to the table, one of them with 2 championships and an insanely long career in Formula One. And so while this year may not be the best year for the team, 2026 is probably going to be a big shakeup for them. And if you've been a long-term Aston Martin fan, it might be fun to go along for the ride. So I hope you have enjoyed learning a little bit about Aston Martin, who the team was before they became Aston Martin as we know them today, what the team looks like right now, and what the team might look like in the future. If Aston Martin is your team, I would love to know why. And if you haven't decided yet, how does Aston Martin stack up for you against the rest? Let me know what you think about the team. If you learned something new about their history from this episode, I would love to hear from you. If you have any questions about this episode or any other episodes, or just any questions about Formula One in general that you would like me to answer, you can send those in a number of ways. If you're listening to this podcast on YouTube, you can just leave your questions in the comments down below. If you're listening to this podcast elsewhere, you can either go to YouTube and find this episode and leave your questions there, or you can find me on social media. I am at Marissa Kamare on Instagram, TikTok, and Threads, and you can send your questions in on any of those platforms. And you can also join our Discord server for Grid Chat. I will put the link for all of those options down in the episode description below. And if you join the Grid Chat Discord server, you'll find that we have a lot of fun. Today we watched F1 75 together. During the race season, we watched the races together. It's a really nice community to kind of spend some time with and not watch Formula One all on your own. I hope you're enjoying this Grid Chat University series, and the next episode we will be breaking down Alpine. Be sure to send in any questions that you have, and I'll see you for the next episode of Grid Chat University.